Ambassador, it comes to my mind that the four major assignments that were there during your career in the Foreign Service, and I'm referring as Secretary West, then High Commissioner in London, followed by being Foreign Secretary and Washington. These were all during Atal Bihari Vajpayee's innings as Prime Minister. Now, you would have obviously dealt with him and seen at the highest level from the Foreign Service the policies, the attitude, the views of the Prime Minister Vajpayee. What would you like to say in that regard?
Well, as I have maintained, Vajpayee is my favorite Prime Minister.
Okay.
For very personal reasons that I have worked so closely with him and therefore have developed a great admiration for him. As a person, he was a very simple person and he was a different kind of Prime Minister.
Okay.
He spoke very little and foreign dignitaries had trouble coming to terms with his habit of breaking off in the middle of a sentence.
Okay.
And I had to brief them to say, that is a pause, that's not the end of the sentence.
Okay.
And please wait for him to give his reply before you start another sentence. But these are personal observations. But it's not just Vajpayee the person, it's Vajpayee the Prime Minister that I admire.
Yes.
And why do I say that? From a very professional point of view, and not that somebody has studied it or there have been declarations, but my experiences.
Yes.
As a diplomat for over 40 years, makes me understand the magnitude of the change that was brought about by Vajpayee. Now, I will illustrate the change in terms of change in principles and doctrines and changes in diplomatic practice, which I will call initiatives. Now, what were the changes in doctrine? I will list about 5 of them, and it's not exhaustive. The 5 principles are that after 5 decades of the policy whose guidelines had been laid by Pandit Nehru, these were changed, these were overhauled by Mr. Vajpayee. Number 1, in place of the sort of fuzzy idealism that were there in Indian foreign policy, we see a new dynamic realism coming up in India's foreign policy that was marked under Vajpayee. Number 2, let me illustrate the changes. The changes are that the slogans of the Indian foreign policy, which had become somewhat negative, anti-colonialism, anti-apartheid, anti-imperialism, anti-this, anti-that. In Mr. Vajpayee's time, all this was cleared off the desk. And there was a greater clarity that foreign policy should be based on India's national interests.
Okay.
Okay, that was a big change. The second change was that the concept of India's security underwent a change. Again, not announced as such, but I could see the change. That the concept of security as the protection of India's territorial integrity and sovereignty was now expanded to mean India's strategic interests abroad. And that was a big change.
Okay.
Okay. Third is related to this one, that now there were new stakeholders in Indian foreign policy. Earlier it was assumed that the MEA is the ministry that formulates foreign policy under the guidance of the Prime Minister. Now, new stakeholders come into it, not just the MEA, but you have the Home Ministry, the Finance Ministry, the Defense Ministry, the Ministry of Science and Technology. So, the Commerce and Industry. These are new elements, new stakeholders that are coming into it, and foreign policy was now much more of a composite exercise, not just confined to formulations made in the MEA. Okay. The third is that the new I've made 3 points: idealism, national security redefined,
and the other stakeholders. Yes.
The fourth one is a very important one because it involves India's relationship with countries abroad. Now, for the first 5 decades, there was an understanding that all countries were equally important. A kind of sarva desha samabhava, every country is sovereign, every country has a vote in the UN, and every country has to be treated equal. Imagine that one of our prime ministers, I will not name, went to a country called Burkina Faso, which most people will have trouble in finding on the map. But every country is important, why not Burkina Faso? Okay, now he changed that, Vajpayee changed that by bringing in a system we know now as strategic partnership. This is exclusive relationships with countries which are important for India's national interests. And one by one, these countries were identified, selected, and a strategic partnership agreement was signed. So, during Vajpayee's time, we had strategic partnerships with France, with Germany, with the United States, with Russia, with Iran. And so, this was something new in India's foreign policy. So, non-alignment, which was the main pillar of Indian foreign policy, is now replaced by what is now called multiple alignments, co-alignments. Many other terms are being used.
And it is also individual bilateral equations with
Absolutely.
yes.
Absolutely. Bilateral, and then it turned into
Multilateral and yes.
What is called minilateral, plurilateral, and so on. There are new terms coming up. And fifth, that for the first time, the non-resident Indians and people of Indian origins, the NRIs and the PIOs, were recognized as legitimate stakeholders in foreign policy. And this is important because Vajpayee was the one who recognized this. He appointed a commission which submitted a report. It was headed by the late Dr. Singhvi. And then Mr. Vajpayee instituted the Pravasi Bharatiya Sammelan, the once-a-year meeting of the leaders of the PIOs and NRIs, and the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, which is also a very coveted decoration from the Government of India. So, 5 major changes, doctrinal changes I will call, in foreign policy. Then I turn to his diplomatic practice, which I will call his initiatives, his major initiatives, which will illustrate what his foreign policy was about. Let's come to his first initiative. 1998, one of his first decisions as Prime Minister was to conduct a nuclear test. And Prime Ministers before him had hesitated because of the risks involved, but Vajpayee took the risk. And it was a traumatic period for us because it seemed as if the whole world was condemning India for carrying out the test, because it was against the NPT, against everything else, and the big powers are opposed to anybody else having nuclear weapons. Okay? But Vajpayee took that test, and there was global condemnation led by the United States. A very angry President Clinton took the initiative in putting even more stringent sanctions against India.
Who was the foreign minister then when this test took place?
Jaswant Singh.
Jaswant Singh.
Yes, okay. Yes. That was a bold decision, but he went. Now, I come to his second initiative, which was the outreach to the United States. It also in a way linked to the first one, because the nuclear tests took our relations to the lowest level that I can imagine in our history. That there was a total boycott of India, and it was very personal with President Clinton. Now, while this was taking place,
just I'd like to intervene. Don't you think that the lowest was during Mrs. Gandhi and Nixon's meeting?
No, that was like a personal difference.
Okay.
This was between countries.
Okay.
At no point, I think, in my personal opinion, India seemed so isolated and so sanctioned. We were not, we were used to some sanctions, but the massive sanctions which were taken off only after the nuclear deal was signed. So there is a history to it. Now, Mr. Vajpayee took a very brilliant tactical initiative. He nominated External Affairs Minister Jaswant Singh to start a dialogue with Strobe Talbot, the US Deputy Secretary of State. And more important than Talbot's title was the fact that he was a confidant of President Clinton. And this was a 19-month dialogue. It'll interest you to know that we don't know what they discussed.
Okay.
For 19 months, this dialogue took place.
Yes.
And of course, there are classified records
Okay.
of meetings which took place. But as I remember those meetings,
Yes.
we had a rather perfunctory meeting of delegations, and we did a lot of
Really, nothing came out of it.
And the real discussion took place in exclusive places,
Okay.
in fancy dinners or lunches, where they had ample time to talk and chat.
Okay.
It was not just about foreign policy and strategic issues, but I know it for a fact that it covered a wide range. It was like India and the United States having a dialogue after 50 years of hostility.
You would say it was sort of a ice breaking?
It was ice breaking. And I tell you how it was ice breaking. Clinton, who was so against India for the nuclear test, after this 19-month dialogue between Jaswant Singh and Strobe Talbot, agreed to come on a state visit to India. And it was a presidential visit after 22 years. 22 years India had not seen an American president on its soil. And so it was path-breaking. It was a watershed moment. Clinton's friendship then became evident.
Okay.
But still, the sanctions were in place because it took time to negotiate the removal of the sanctions. So the outreach to USA was important because today, the relationship with the United States is the centerpiece of Indian foreign policy. And we know that Prime Minister Modi made one of the most successful visits of any Prime Minister to the United States in just about a month ago. Okay. What was his third
Initiative?
Third initiative was to look at the neighborhood. Somehow the neighborhood gets neglected when India focuses on global politics or regional politics. So Mr. Vajpayee started with Pakistan and the historic bus trip to Lahore in 1999. What happened then? He went in the bus. He went to the Minar-e-Pakistan, which was a monument to the creation of Pakistan, which of course India was not a part of. But Vajpayee declared friendship with Pakistan at the Minar-e-Pakistan. And the Pakistanis responded by hailing this new approach, new friendship. But typically, as we know Pakistan, they betrayed this friendship with the clandestine occupation of Kargil. And here, Vajpayee, as the messenger of peace, is in a new avatar as the Prime Minister of war. And the Kargil conflict was again meticulously done by our armed forces and won the admiration of all the countries of the world because India was considered to be justified in protecting its border and in throwing out the Pakistanis from Indian soil. And the greatest outcome of this was the approach of Bill Clinton. He summoned both prime ministers to the White House. Mr. Vajpayee had the dignity to say no.
Yes.
But the Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif had no option. He went to the White House, pleaded with Clinton, said, do something against India, do something for Kashmir. Clinton said no. your troops have to get out, and finally that's what happened. It was America's pressure, and for the first time you notice that America was not automatically siding with Pakistan. America was actually supporting India because they thought it was just. And so this was the turnaround which I think mattered the most.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Then Vajpayee took the initiative on China. China, his thinking was on Nehruvian lines, that we can negotiate with China and show goodwill, and we can resolve our differences. So he did his best. First, President Narayanan was sent on a state visit to Beijing, and I, as Foreign Secretary, I accompanied him. President Narayanan had very cordial discussions with his counterpart, President Chiang Cheh-min. After that, Mr. Vajpayee himself decided to make a trip to Beijing. That was in 2003. And then many agreements were signed. The most consequential one was the agreement on the political parameters of a settlement of the border dispute. This was done. Mr. Vajpayee also showed his goodwill by making changes in the levels of negotiation.
Okay.
When, earlier, after Nehru and Zhou Enlai had discussions on the border, then it was left to the senior officials on both sides at Joint Secretary level. Then the foreign secretaries on both sides were asked to have annual negotiations with the Chinese, and that prevailed till 2003. Mr. Vajpayee said, no, it is important enough, let us take it to a political level. So from Foreign Secretary, it went to the National Security Advisor, and Brajesh Mishra was made responsible for those negotiations. I probably would be one of the last foreign secretaries to head the annual negotiations with China. After that, the level went up.
Yes.
Okay. So this is the series of the initiatives that Vajpayee took, and many others. But I'm paying attention to these ones because they reflect his mindset that he wanted the best things to happen, but if it went against India's interests, there would be nobody more ferocious than Vajpayee. So I think he did bring about great changes in both the principles and the practice of Indian foreign policy.